law. And it seems to me that there are sort of two big questions. One, there's clearly potential division between looking at the EU inside the EU and what it wants to do with its policy and the resource policy, and there are a whole lot of legal questions of competence, does it have the competence, and so on, which are going to likely be raised. So there's a lot of issues there. And then there's a whole question of the international stage and what is going on in international law, GATT. And again, when we get to the position of the EU, and I'm sure people will know that in the room, you know, their role on the international stage, particularly in trade, is very important. And I think the other sort of general question, which lawyers often ask themselves, and I'm beginning to think of this new challenge about raw materials and where we go. I mean, do we have an existing legal framework which can actually cope with it? You know, it's got the principles, we've got them there. There's a question of applying those principles to perhaps a rather new set of circumstances. Or are we dealing with something which is raising very novel issues, which actually the law hasn't really dealt with? In our own centre, we're doing work on carbon capture and storage, and that's one of the questions we're constantly asking ourselves. Is this something very new, the types of long-term liabilities, or is it something actually we've already coped with? So I hope that will be a question that will come up. Having said this is about legal and policy, because the first speaker I'm going to invite is David Baldock, who is not a lawyer, but he's a kind of honorary lawyer, and I'm not going to read out, I think that's a compliment. I'm not going to read out all the CVs, you can do them, but he has been for many years director of the Institute of European Environmental Policy. And I actually do remember, David, you might remember, when we first came into contact, when I was about 26, and you were about the same age, I think. And I suppose it was a sort of object lesson in resource efficiency. What we were trying to do in London, as part of an NGO campaign, was to say there are lots of these gardens which are being totally underused for food production. They're very idealistic. And there are lots of people who haven't got access to gardens and want to grow food and want to grow resources, and we're going to try and put them together. And so David was the kind of dating agency, and I was the lawyer trying to construct agreements about, you know, if you use somebody else's garden, did you get the right to the carrots and all of that. So we were there in resource efficiency, David, a long time ago. And the other thing which is going to be rather strange about this presentation is we know that the commissioner official who was going to be here, I don't know where he is, he's in the air or on the train, or he is on the train coming. To a certain extent, this, you know, particularly David, was going to kind of react and critique probably his presentation. So you're now going to do it in reverse. You're going to set up the critique before you've heard him, but that's very good as well. Okay. I'll set him up all right.
Thanks, Richard. I'm sure it was not easy following Tony Blair, and following a lawyer is always a bit of a dodgy thing to do. In the case of the gardens, what happened, it was interesting, this is a very long time ago, we had a lot of elderly people who were very keen to have someone who looked after their garden, and there weren't that many people who wanted to do it. So it wasn't so easy to match supply and demand. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, the political context and some of the specific things going on as I see it in the European agenda, to give you a perspective on the RMI. And starting off with the thought that it clearly is a kind of issue which makes sense to deal with at a European level. And in the UK, we're very sensitive to this at the moment. The government has initiated something called a balanced competence review, borrowing EU jargon, interestingly, in order to pursue this national agenda. It's even divided into semesters following the European approach. It's quite funny. And so we're going through a process of trying to say, well, which topic should be addressed nationally and which at the European level. And clearly this particular area has a lot of characteristics which suggest a European approach was quite desirable, including the fact we have EU competence for trade, including the fact we have a single market, including the fact that most of our strategic objectives in this area, including environmental ones, are done at a European level. And also it's a big topic, and we just heard on the information side that it's difficult to keep up to date, keep on track with the US, and pooling resources in Europe makes sense. Having said that, you could say that progress on the RMI has not been spectacularly fast, and there have been perhaps some slightly disappointing slow outcomes on this. And I think there are quite a few reasons for that, which we can talk about. As a prelude to that, though, I'd just like to mention 5 tensions, as I see it, which sort of, at the moment, apply across virtually all EU policy. One of them is the one between what is to be done at the European and what is the national level, subsidiarity in EU jargon. A second one is the tension between economic growth and sustainability. So in other words, it's quite hard pushing forward environmental measures at the moment, either through the Commission or through the Council, when they're considered to be even potentially in conflict with any kind of growth and jobs agenda. Thirdly, there's a whole issue about regulation, and a lot of the measures in this area are to do with regulation, product standards, and there's a sense that regulation may be too heavy at a European level, too burdensome, that are there other ways of doing things through economic instruments and so forth. Then there's the whole question about should we be augmenting the EU acquis communautaire, the legal base, or should we be implementing it better? And if you read the 7th Environmental Action Programme, which I quite recommend, strange enough, it does give you a bit of a sense of where we are in environmental policy and why implementation, as opposed to simply augmentation, is almost certainly going to be a priority in the next few years. And so what this adds up to is some sort of tension between high aspirations and actual delivery, whether it's delivery in the form of measures to deliver the aspirations or the implementation of those measures. And that's what we see very much in this agenda. So the RMI fits quite well into the broader sort of European strategic documents, most of which are mentioned very much in the background paper. They include the Europe 2020 the economic strategy. This is the dominant and the most living strategy at a European level. Although in many ways it predates some of the realities of the crisis of the euro and events of the last 2 years. Resource efficiency is a priority in there. There's a semester process which does include reports on what member states are doing, including on resource efficiency to some extent. That's a relatively new thing, and again, perhaps worth flagging up. You can follow the semester process. It's, again, not very transparent. And I was in a meeting the other day where Petroleum, the Environment Commission, said, well, you all ought to be reading these semester reports. I don't think many people do. So there's certainly intention that the thread of the objectives goes through to the national level, it's not just the EU. Secondly, a much less well-known document is the EU Sustainable Development Strategy, which in principle is actually very much an overarching approach which the RMI fits into, but in practice it's a very low-key strategy in Brussels at the moment, and it's going to be reviewed in the next year or two in principle. I don't know what's going to happen to that. Third overarching document, 7th Environmental Action Programme, and I think the important point about that is it does flag up resource efficiency, which tends to be the jargon used in Brussels as a key measure for the period up to 2020. So if environment policy is going to go anywhere in Europe, climate is obviously a key issue. Resource efficiency is the second key issue on that agenda. Some questions about biodiversity too. Having said all that, I would say that the RMI is not a particularly high-profile measure. Maybe that's a bit surprising. You don't hear people talking about it. I'm on some group which concerns itself with key enabling technologies. I don't think I've ever heard it mentioned on this group, for And I think that is a bit indicative of the lack of profile for the RMI. Will that change? Well, it could. What we do know is going to happen is that the whole effort directed at resource efficiency is going to be stepped up. And this is going to happen through what we anticipate being more of an effort to give some life to the roadmap for resource efficiency in Europe, which is quite an ambitious document. It covers a large number of different sorts of resources, from the natural through to minerals and so forth. And this was got through the Commission in 2011. It's been discussed at the member state level, but it is yet to really take off as a series of actual clear targets or measures or outcomes. And the RMI really sort of belongs alongside that as a tool for delivering this agenda. And at the moment, there's quite a lot of lack of clarity about really how much priority this has been given either at the Commission end or in the Member States. The Environment Commissioner Petroleum is certainly very committed to it, but that's obviously different to the Commission as a whole being committed to it. We're now at the stage where this lack of clarity hopefully will be lifted a bit. The two particular things worth mentioning here. One is that there's a platform for resource efficiency in Brussels, which I think is due to report in June. This brings together different stakeholders and will probably try to launch a slightly more proactive approach in terms of measures. And secondly, we're expecting in May this year a whole package from the Commission. And so when this appears, we will start to see how much weight is going to be given to the whole resource efficiency front. Now, before coming here, I was trying to figure out what we knew inside these issues about what's going to be in this package, and other people may have slightly clearer ideas than me. But our understanding right now is, first of all, it will certainly include a review of waste directives. The 5 directives in particular being looked at and being ex post analysis. There's a whole overview of EU waste policy, the so-called fitness check. And this is an opportunity for a review of regulations without opening up their entire objectives, particularly, more looking at how they've been put into practice, what the problems have been, where there are excessive administrative burdens, where the reporting arrangements are unsatisfactory, where they can be improved. We've had one fitness check on water, so the fitness check is a draft of that's already started to appear, and so there'll be a whole review of waste policy. Secondly, we're expecting some publication of work on targets in the EU for resource efficiency. And I don't know whether they're going to be actual targets or not. This is considered by many people a critical point, because we've seen in climate policy, for example, having quantitative targets with a date over time has crystallized the whole political debate about what measures then follow the targets. And the target doesn't create a measure, it doesn't create action on the ground. But in a typical EU debate, it helps to crystallize some action. And there's been a lot of discussion over quite some time about what the nature of these targets should be and what indicators should be. So if these targets are agreed, and a lot of countries, the UK prominent among them, do not particularly like targets, and other countries like Germany, where they do actually have some targets already, so there's different perspectives in Europe on this subject. Without any targets, it probably signals a much sort of diminished approach to the urgency of the issue. We're also expecting some discussion about incentives for business to invest more in resource efficiency in one way or another, and an overall stock-taking document looking at where we've got to in this whole sphere. And I think there will be more of an emphasis on packaging the agenda into more of a circular economy type of dialogue, because I think a lot of people in Brussels see resource efficiency as a slightly unsexy wrapper to put things in. And I will probably let people start to say, well, what's going to be the post-Potocnik wrapper? You know, if resource efficiency is too much, you know, associated with this particular commission and this commission. If this all appears in May, it will be a sort of final push from this commission. A new commission then comes in November, a new parliament comes in May. So we do not know whether this set of measures will be picked up, whether it will be given life or not. And it's going to be therefore extremely important to see how it's received, not only at member state level where there's going to be more consistency, but how the new European Parliament reacts. And if we look back at sort of progress on RMI, because it's a mixed competence issue, some parts of it, like sort of pillar 2 of it, are very much rely on soft measures. This information exchange, cooperation between government, and I don't think one would expect any large change from that. It will continue to be a relatively slow negotiation around that. The question really is on pillar 3, which is more the domestic resources, more the recycling, more generating, whether that can be activated. So it will need, I would say, an absolute step change in the level of attention that it's had up to now. There have been people valiantly keeping this vessel afloat, but it's been progressing much more slowly through the water than you might expect. So if it's to come up to the level of a convincing and central element of European policy, it's going to need not only a convincing package coming out before the end of this commission, but actually then a rather significantly more energetic follow-up beyond the new commission in the new parliament.
I'm going to introduce Gunter, who's already spoken. And again, his CV is in there, but one of the things I did want to mention, he's too modest for me to mention himself, his massive tone on, on general international mineral policy and the legal basis for mineral policy in Europe in 40 countries. And I know this is Europe, this is not the European Union, that's why it's 40 countries. But very important. Are you prepared to reveal the price? I know this is Springer fine, which has been probably about £200, I suspect. A snip. But it is actually, I mean, one of the things that maybe you want to touch on this, if you just looking at your tables of different countries in Europe, is that the state ownership of minerals is completely different, even with the EU. I mean, I know, you know, the UK, oil and gas and gold and silver is owned by the Crown. You look up Hungary, you look up Austria, you look up Germany, it's a completely different set of variations. Now, I don't know whether that will be significant in this debate, that actually, in terms of actual minerals, who owns it is quite different. And the thought of the EU trying to harmonise ownership of minerals will not go down very well. Anyway, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I think Professor Plaschitz for this kind invitation to participate. In fact, I'm concerned with this topic since many years. We started with an EU-wide mineral planning policy study in 2004. We conducted the Leoben study. And then I used to work on this topic more and more, and suddenly I thought I could write a book. Not one book, yes, a second book. Because the one book is linked to the policy part, and the second book is related to the legal basis of the European minerals policy. Currently, I'm involved in an EU project. It's called the SNAP-C project. I will introduce this project. And a second project, Extracted, FP7 project, how you can mine the future in a very deep underground based on ICT using robotics. Now the content of my presentation. I would like to start with some short introduction. Then I would like to say something about the EU mineral policy and its impact on the national policies. I then will provide examples of national minerals policies and of the member states, selected member states, and conclusions. I was told I shall keep my presentation short, 10 minutes. Now we will see if I should speak a little bit longer. The title of the presentation is Policy and Legal Challenges of Reducing Raw Materials Dependency in the EU. I mean, the need of minerals is a global issue. It was already mentioned that more and more need of minerals, not only from China or Brazil, is existing, but they are exporting less and less minerals. You can see clearly the rare earth minerals. So it is really important to think about how to reduce the raw materials dependency in the European Union. There are several possibilities. I mean, increase very strongly the exploration activities in the member states. I mean, where there is a mining potential, of course, to increase the recycling as well. The Euro mining, but third, to increase the resource efficiency, to have new innovative materials, even to think on substitution. And clearly you can also reduce, if you want them, based on policies, the minerals consumption. If you say use wood instead of raw materials. And you can develop new technologies like we try to highlight in this project, Extracted. It was already mentioned today that Europe still has a considerable mining potential, but we need new technologies, and finally we need the right policy framework. Dealing with policies is a matter of the government. We can set priorities. So it is depending how you design your mineral policy. In 2011, a very important communication was published by the European Commission tackling the challenges on raw materials, which clearly recommended from its member states to develop a national minerals policy. And there are three important sections mentioned. Let me tell you very short what is a mineral policy framework. how to define mineral policy. I tried to define it in my book, the entirety of operations of a state influencing on mineral supply on its territory and beyond. And the same for the European level. But clearly the state is acting and providing a framework for the concerned stakeholders. And when I'm saying a framework, it is really important to be in mind to consider consolidated interrelations. We need to have a consolidated dialogue, an accepted dialogue when creating a minerals policy framework. In fact, each country has a certain kind of mineral policy, but when speaking of a minerals policy framework, we then have accepted agreed approach from the different stakeholders. And the EU recommended here 3 main aspects. And clearly this is an internal aspect of a national minerals policy. The external aspect is concerning trade policy and so on. But I was really surprised when I saw this this recommendation, because it was always what I was, and experts speaking or even dreaming to set up a clear defined national minerals policy framework which clearly ensures the mineral supply in a harmonized manner based on sustainability. Harmonized manner is important. That means you have to harmonize the minerals policy even with the other concerned policies, environmental, social, human policies, whatever, because the minerals policy is a cross-cutting topic. And this is clearly a fact. And we would have to research much more deeper in this topic. The second, the recommendation to define a minerals planning policy based on land use planning. That means to check your mining potential and your resources, reserves, and second, to harmonize it with your land use planning management. That means bringing the different utilization claims, taking it into account, and selecting raw material priority zones where you can be sure to mine the deposits and to have a certain accepted agreement. And for me, the minerals planning policy is element of a national policy framework. So the third one is the creation of an authorization procedure for exploring and extracting minerals. This is very important. We really did a lot of projects and we had a lot of meetings, and the mining companies and as well the authorities always told it is hard game. The permitting procedures are so long and complicated. When we published the Leoben study in 2004, we could see the average permission permitting duration for the member states more or less 5 to 10 years. That means really a challenge for investment security for the mining companies, but as well for the government, for the authority which is handling the procedures, as well a challenge because time consuming for everybody, much money. So it is important to think, if you have a land use planning related to minerals in your country, this will facilitate as well your authorization procedure. You have already predefined information. The publication of the Raw Materials Initiative 2008 and 2011 was a paradigm change. In terms of the existing of national minerals planning policies, frameworks. When I was writing my book, publishing in 2011, it was 2-3 countries which published their minerals strategy policy framework. That was Finland and Germany. Now we can observe more countries which started to discuss and establish a minerals policy framework. But let me tell you, it is important to have in mind such a framework is based on objectives, strategies related to objectives, and of course to actions or action plan, and a monitoring plan to monitor the implementation of such a yes?
Yeah.
I have 5 minutes.
Yeah. I should have just said that. Yeah, is that all right? I'm getting a signal.
Okay. So some examples, the minerals policy of Greece, the objectives, you can see aiming at sufficient constant mineral supply and using best practices. And based on these objectives, they implemented, they defined their actions to establish a forum for the implementation of the national policy and adequate land use planning, and they also are aiming to codification and harmonization of the mining legislation. What is important for Greece is to simplify their procedures to implement new standards and to avoid overlapping procedures, even to strengthen the role of inspecting the inspection authorities. Minerals policy of Portugal. Clearly the objectives are to increase the exploration and what I believe is very interesting, to establish an office related to the one-stop shop procedure, concentrated procedures. Sweden, the objective of the minerals policy of Sweden is again to increase exploration of their mining potential in harmonization with the environment, clearly also to increase the recycling potential and to improve the framework conditions. All these mineral policies were published in the last 2 years. Finally, the mineral policy of Netherlands is aiming at securing mineral supply, but especially taking into account the recycling and even restrict the national demand for raw materials, say substitution, and the example of minerals planning policy, the Austrian Mineral Resources Plan, which was developed in the last 10 years, we can say, and the results now are implemented in the regulatory framework. And the so-called SNAP-SEED project, you can find leaflets, is a land use planning related project. In Southeastern Europe, East Europe, we are discussing tools and managing approaches, how to use the land use planning in order to secure mineral supply. So the conclusions. Very clearly the progress on the national level is facilitated by the volunteers initiative process. Of course, the implementation of the policies in the regulatory framework needs time. And finally, I mean, it is research. There is a huge need of research to explore such topics in detail, and maybe to think on project activities in this respect. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Recently been asked, and I've just completed a book chapter on property rights in sector legal frameworks, and the condition for writing the chapter was that they explicitly did not want a lawyer to write it. So I bring a broad public policy background into this debate about resource-based development. I am at the University of Dundee as an honorary lecturer. I've worked there until 2009. Nowadays I go up once or twice a year, and the rest of my time to teach a course on public policies for resource-based development. The rest of my time I spend as an advisor for industry associations, and sometimes for development agencies, usually around issues of extractive industries, sometimes covering finance issues. What I've been asked and want to contribute to this debate here is about the external perspective of the Raw Materials Initiative. So that's looking at producer countries outside of Europe, and with particular focus on low and middle income countries. And what I wanted to do is to look at what the Raw Materials Initiative says about the connection between development policy and access to resources in these countries, and the sort of things that were mentioned in the introduction is we're dealing often here with failed states, countries that have huge issues about equity inside, we're concerned about protective measures, national resource nationalisms, and those sorts of constraints that we see might hinder the access that European countries get to raw materials. So what I thought I'd do is to first review what the Raw Materials Initiative says about the development policy link to the to gaining access, and then to be a bit provocative and ask, does it actually stack up? What if we look at the experiences around resource-based development? You know, does that link with the sort of instruments that the Raw Materials Initiative is mentioning? So to review that, the instruments that I read out of the Raw Materials Initiatives to bringing a development policy angle to supporting sustainable development in producer countries mentions three things. One's very strongly good governance, and there's a focus on transparency. The ITI has been mentioned, so that's seen to be one thing that could support resource-based development. The second is it mentions CSR rules and standards, so that's something that probably applies to companies and what they have to do. And then the third thing, very sort of briefly mentioned, is investing in linkages and infrastructure. So presumably that's where the role of development policy will also come in terms of possibly supporting supply chains and building linkages between the extractives and other economic sectors. So does this end up with where the access problems come from? I think it might help there to review where the position that's perhaps coming from within the EU comes from with respect to what the three main debates have been around producer countries. And if you go back to the 80s, 90s, the discussion was very much about opportunities. Countries that had experienced economic crises in the past could open up to foreign investment coming into the extractive industry sectors, so they could leverage opportunities around these sectors to get them back on track. And so the legal and policy issues at that time were very much geared towards what you have to provide for foreign investment to come in. There was some mentioning about the importance of macroeconomic policies, and then sort of starting to think about that there might be macroeconomic challenges associated with particularly export-oriented industries. Yeah? That's the stuff about Dutch disease and declining terms of trade, those sorts of things. And there was also recognition that these large-scale projects that were starting in these sorts of countries were having local impacts, environmental as well as social, that had to be dealt with, and so therefore we had a development of standards responding to that for the industry to comply with. But the framework as such on the international level was about legal frameworks and policies that are serving the investment to come in. The second debate then that started sort of from the 1990s and then more so in the 2000s, then shifted to what are the risks associated with this development of investment coming into these countries. And it's the sort of discussion about resource curves and the shift from macroeconomics to political economic type impacts, where we're looking at the negatives of export-oriented industries in terms of what they do to the politics, to the state capacity in these countries, and it's some of the stuff associated with failed states. The challenge was there that we did see some variance in outcomes across these countries, where there are at least some countries that have done well out of their resources that didn't quite match this negative picture that was coming on the other side. Yeah? So that led people to sort of try and find what are the conditions that make for this variance, and we all landed on saying, oh, it's the good institutions and it's the good governance that makes for that difference. And that then led into the development of various initiatives that focus on improving governance, come institutions. And we know, there's like 20, 30 of those initiatives. Most prominent among them is the ITI and the Revenue Watch Institute and those sorts of things. But the hope is that by improving institutions in the producer countries, they will benefit from us wanting to export the stuff. Yeah? So then the third debate is much more recent, is 2000 and 2010. We're now starting to think about, we've got conflicts and tensions arising. What is that? Where do they come from? And we have sort of three sets of conflicts there. We have between producer and consumer countries. Yeah? We have them between governments and the resource developers, so the companies that have been investing. And we have them between the companies and the communities, whichever way we define them. Yeah? So we've got lots of conflicts and tensions that somehow we try to solve, and the stuff that we've done before doesn't quite address it. And then the second debate that's come in the sort of more recent years is how to deliver wider benefits to countries, and much of that is around building linkages. So what we do there, what we see there is now companies shifting from their sort of more narrow CSR to how do they maintain or first gain and then maintain their license to operate. For producer countries, it's the questions about, maybe we have to think about building linkages as something to do with industrial policy. Yeah, maybe we have to revive that sort of thought from the 70s and do it better this time round. And for the countries that provide development assistance, there are some questions that are being asked now about what's the role of development aid in building linkages, and does it add up with what we've been doing in the past, yeah? And the focuses that we had in the past. Now, if I consider these three debates and I put it in the context of what the Raw Materials Initiative says about development policy, I think for lending from the 80s and 90s is this undistorted access to markets. Yeah? We need to get the stuff imported into our countries. That is tied to the legal and policy type reforms that have looked at it from the perspective of that time. Yeah? So we look at laws and policies in order to do investments in these countries in order to export them as an input into what we're trying to achieve. Yeah? Not as an outcome of what might happen in these countries and how they formulate policies and laws. Lending from the 1990s and 20s, we're responding still to the risks of resource curves, and that's why we're also concerned about transparency and good governance and how to bring that about through perhaps development aid. But both of those approaches are pretty much top-down and externally imposed. We're giving relatively little thought, little thought to what's happening within these countries. Where do the contradictions between conflicts and tensions, the various dimensions, come from, and how does that relate to that? We're recognizing that if we want to build linkages and bring resource-based development to these countries, we have to cooperate. Because the sorts of things that we have to do in order to link sectors act in order to transform economies from merely being exporters to some, that they can do other economic activities that broaden opportunities for the people living there. It's not about tension, it's not about being opposed to each other, it's about working together. Yeah? So that doesn't quite stack up with where we are on the development policy side. Not yet. So in a way, I just like to put one slide up to show this, because I think what we're seeing is that the good governance of the resources sectors, where we are now thinking about the role of policies and law, is very much doing a shortcut, yeah? Where we've got quite a lot of academic work that has looked at laws and policies as part of good institutions as an input, and we're concluding from that, in order to achieve certain outcomes that we would like to see on the development policy side, yeah, in order to secure our access, we've got to use that as the objective of what development aid tries to do. So it's kind of a shortcut from one side down to where we've recognized which we think we've recognized which policies and laws support good institutions to outcomes. But if we take a step back and we look at what the broader social science literature says about property rights and how they're formulated and how countries have achieved resource-based development, it's not that shortcut, it's a much longer route. Yeah? And that longer route looks at policies and laws as an outcome of processes that are specific to a country context. And if I relate to my previous speaker, he was looking at the variety that exists across the 40 European countries. Yeah? So it's a lot more about getting into what are the multiple actors that influence processes in particular country contexts. And it puts the emphasis on laws and policies as outcomes. As an academic, I would want to look at that, because a lot has been done there, but that's the sort of area that we haven't looked at more closely. And then in terms of how are countries enforcing those sorts of laws and policies that they have formulated within their particular context, it's the public administration type of literature would say it's about interdependent processes where you've got to connect our ministries, you've got to connect our industry with public policies in a broader range than just the sort of narrow ones for the sector. And so what sort of capabilities in terms of types of characteristics of states and the coherence across a broader range of public policies allows you to enforce sorts of broader, more comprehensive institutional frameworks that lead to the outcomes that we would like to get. So what I would conclude from that is basically what I see so far from the Raw Materials Initiative. It's not very evolved on the role of development policy to support this concern around ensuring access. And I think it's sort of 4 points as to what we ought to look closer at, either if you're coming from the academic angle, but also in terms of the concerns that industry and companies are particularly facing on a much more practical level. It's a greater focus on the policy processes happening within countries. Yeah? It's not about externally imposing something that we think is the right thing to do for them. And so that's really taking recognition of particular country contexts in relation to what are the actual sector activities, what are the actual projects taking place in a particular country context. Yeah? You see lots of reform programs targeted at the sector that actually don't look at what sorts of projects are in the pipeline, who's already there. That sort of thing seems to be marginal. Yeah? For example, if you look at reform to education and skills development, there's no mention of that mining or gas is actually the sector that drives this economy, and so therefore, an education policy reform project should actually cater for the industry that drives this economy. So you see that quite a lot. Then the distributive considerations about who's gaining from these sectors and how to broaden out the opportunities, perhaps through supply chain development and those sorts of things, not much thought about that either. And then I think that what strikes me on the 2030 initiatives that we have, they're all focused on the sector alone, yeah? But it's not the sector alone, it's all the other things around it, infrastructure, utilities, education, skills development, that enable the sector, yeah? So perhaps that should be focused on more too, so we have to go beyond the sort of transparency and sector governance perspective. And I think that the more critical part is the question around the role of the state, where industrial policy to support cross-sectoral linkages and essentially sort of a more active role of government and the state in connecting when against the background of that having failed in the past, that's actually a quite critical discussion in there. It's mentioned in the African mining vision, which the raw materials initiatives flags up, but it doesn't actually discuss what that conflict will mean. Because if we drill into the details, it's not obvious that it's a shared interest. There is actually quite a lot. You could see a lot of conflicts in that. So those would be my observations on where the development policy aspect of the raw materials stands to date, and I think that kind of shares some of the thoughts and connotations of the first speaker, that perhaps there's quite a lot more work to be done there. Thank you.